All right. Thank you again for the opportunity from the Chamber and from CareerSource Broward. This is an excellent opportunity. I really enjoy learning more about South Florida, especially the labor market, and seeing definitely different throughout Florida, and really focusing on South Florida is very interesting. And I get to see a lot of changes and differences relative to throughout the state, but I really enjoy looking at South Florida. I was there last week in Fort Lauderdale. I always enjoy the opportunity. Unfortunately, it didn't work out to get to visit this time, but I always enjoy the opportunity. So I appreciate that for these opportunities. To give just a quick overview of what I was looking to do, just give a kind of a brief overview on the U.S. economic environment. Kind of what's going on right now. Banking has been the industry we talked a little bit about earlier, and some of the growth that is going on throughout the U.S. right now, but also some concerns that we need to address and just be aware of. Then I'll definitely focus more on Broward County specifically, and so this will focus of the data that I will support. Will focus right on Broward County, and how I came to Broward County. I'll talk about in a minute, and discuss kind of that partnership with CareerSource Broward, and where I got to get involved with Broward County. Wrap up any conclusions, and then open up to any questions that anyone has on that side. So with that, I just first wanted to introduce kind of how I came to Broward County, or how did I get involved with Broward County. I worked for CareerSource Florida back in 90, yeah, and as an economist there, and oversaw the state and some of the indicators throughout the state, and usually South Florida was one of the areas that had a big impact on the state, and specifically labor force. And so as I started a consulting business, I noticed a proposal out for CareerSource Broward to look at the labor market. So in 2022, I was contracted with CareerSource Broward to look at to do a study on the labor market and the economy in Broward County. This was coming out after the pandemic, so right after everything kind of opened up back up, and wanted to really see how that impacted the labor force and kind of what position in early 2022 Broward County was in. The purpose of the study was to share with local employers, businesses, but basically to give them an idea of their resources and how they could adjust and plan for the next 5 to 10 years that we were looking out in terms of forecast and the position that we were currently in, again, in early 2022. From that, and I will definitely emphasize, one of the recommendations was to give more information to the community, give more information to the directors and board members, and businesses. And so from that, we created this workforce and economic dashboard. And I've been working with CareerSource Broward. We update this in real-time basis, and I'll go through some of the indicators that we cover in this dashboard, but it does provide a labor market, cost of living indicators, as well as some tourism indicators, such as deplanements in Fort Lauderdale Airport, and compares that to Miami-Dade International, as well as Palm Beach International. And so we can see kind of how well deplanements are doing, people getting off the airplane and spending some time and spending their money, hopefully, in the economy for the region. So we track that on a monthly basis, as well as other important characteristics in the economy. And this tool and this dashboard has been, I think, very useful for community members, and hopefully gives kind of an insight. So I definitely encourage you, if you get a chance, to use the QR code or go to CareerSource Broward's website, and in the About Us, they have a section for the economic dashboard, and let us know how that goes. We are adding new indicators to it all the time. I know that any feedback would be great, as I think recently added a rent indicator, for example, as I'll actually highlight in this talk how important rent has been recently in the cost of living. So just to kind of throw that out, how I got into Broward County and looking at the labor market there. So to look at the current economic conditions, I do want to highlight what it looked like last year relative to this year. As the study was conducted last year in 2022, it was a little bit different of a concern. So at that time, inflation was the biggest concern. It really hit consumer confidence back then. At that time, I remember inflation was over 8.4%, and very concerned about it. If we look at the top right graph, going up into the double digits, right? Back in the late 70s, early 80s, we experienced very high inflation, well above double digit uh, growth in prices. And so last year in 2022, that was the biggest concern for many residents, many businesses, as costs were escalating. From a positive perspective, with the Federal Reserve's increasing of interest rates and other policy changes, we've actually seen inflation come down, and that's very positive for the economy. This was something that was very concerning last year. I mentioned if it gets above 10%, that was definitely very concerning as well. We're at rates we haven't seen in 30 plus years. And so seeing that come down, seeing some of these higher interest rates take effect has been very good for the consumer, has been very good for kind of calming down these prices or calming down the economic activity right after obviously all this pent up demand from COVID. So we are seeing that this monetary policy start to work. We're seeing inflation come down. It's below 5%. And hopefully we start to see that get into more of that target range of 2 to 3% over the next year. One thing that I found very shocking, and at the time of the study, it was very low at roughly, I think it was 3.5% before COVID outbreak in February 2020 for the US. And it jumped up after that. And at the time of 2021 last year, I thought the unemployment rate was very low, roughly around 4%. I believe, at the nation, and roughly 3.5% for Broward County. And so from that study, the discussion was that we're almost at the lowest point we're going to be for employment. I didn't see the unemployment rate going down much further, and in that last year, it has gotten only stronger. We see that unemployment is down to 2.3% for Broward County. That was, again, a very low number that just came out for the April reading. And so a very healthy labor market right now in Broward County. Going back and looking at some research, I wanted to focus on the Black or African American population and what their impact is in Broward County. The latest data, and this is very hard to come by, went back to January. And at that time, roughly about 43% of all unemployed, so at that time about 26,000 were unemployed, about 43% of them were in the Black population. So from an estimate today, although we have such a low unemployment rate, of course, for Broward County, that estimate is roughly about 5.3% estimated for the Black population in Broward County. Now, that's something that I looked at from data sources and pulled together, so that's not an official release or a specific number that was released by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but using some data, this doesn't come out on a monthly basis. I estimated roughly about 5.5%, somewhere in between there in terms of the current unemployment rate for the Black community. Definitely lower than historical, so that's the positive. But again, opportunities there to see that number come down and get more in line with the county average. From the other concern or the other so unemployment rate very strong, labor market very strong right now. The second the first kind of concern that we saw was in consumer confidence, and we'll talk a little bit about why that dropped. On the bottom right hand side, you see kind of the national and Florida. University of Florida does a great job at tracking the consumer confidence for the state, as well as University of Michigan does for the entire nation. But they pretty much go align with each other. We saw Florida jump a little bit before the rest of the nation as COVID, as we opened up a little bit earlier. But we've started to see that decline again since last year because of some of the banking issues and some of the concerns about the debt ceiling and other financial issues that have been raised with in the news. And so in the last month, this is kind of a preliminary number as of May, but in the last month, we saw a 9% drop in consumer confidence at the US level. Down to 57.7. Again, and a lot of that is falling in terms of what's going to happen politically, whether it be the national debt and also from a banking sector, looking at the concerns there from the banking industry. So just kind of highlighting again from a national perspective, the recent concerns being the debt crisis. I think there's roughly 10 days left. Obviously, from a academic or finance perspective, we don't see them defaulting on any debt, that the U.S. will finally come together. Congress will come together and make the decision to raise the debt ceiling, and hopefully we can move on from this. However, there is typically some negative impacts from that. I know in 2011, the U.S. was downgraded. This had kind of a negative effect on the markets, a negative effect on the economy during that time, as the U.S. could be considered not the go-to source potentially, or again, not a guaranteed repayment. And so if one of the ratings agencies decides to step out and give us a lower rating, that would have a pretty big impact from a financial perspective and likely spill over into the economy. And then also, as the headlines have shown for the last couple months, there, the banking crisis. The issue with Silicon Valley Bank, Signature Bank, and First Republic are expected to be narrowed down and individually firm specific, some of the issues that they had in terms of not diversifying and managing their risks. So we saw some failures there, but hopefully that can be contained to some of the maybe kind of some of the bad apples, and that we see everything kind of come together. But it is a concern right now lingering from the banking crisis perspective. And just to highlight, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just kind of shows the yield curve from a banking perspective and really focuses on what they've impacted in the last 2 years. We had very low rates, as everyone has seen. The gray line was May 12th in 2021. So that yield curve being very upward sloping, positive for the economy 2 years ago. In the last 2 years, that yield curve has changed. And so banks are now facing, and some of the reason for this concern, just to really show you that change is now facing a yield curve that looks more like the blue line in the last 2 years, with an inverted yield curve that typically signals a recession in the U.S. economy. I think it's predicted 5 or 6 of the last recessions in terms of having an inverted yield curve. And so there's definitely concern there and expectations that a recession on some respect is on the horizon. Brian, I do see your hand raised. I don't want to hold up any questions if you had any questions specifically.
Yes, a question that I have is that on the unemployment rate for Broward County, I know that number may be a little skewed because they only track the folks that are submitting their unemployment information, and those folks that have fallen off, that they don't qualify anymore. It could be, that number is not reflective of that population, is it?
Absolutely, Brian. Great comment. So unemployment rate has always been criticized for the potential of that you actually have to actively be seeking employment. And so someone that falls out of the labor force is not counted if you're not actively seeking employment. If you want to take a break, go live at home, whatever the issue is, or the change there in your situation. Again, spouse decides to start working, the other one stays at home, and they fall out of the labor force. That's not counted in the unemployment rate or what the potential labor market looks like. So it is an indicator. We do track it. But Brian, great point. I'll try to make a point later. One thing that's very positive for the region and came out of the study was surprising to me is Broward County is a much better labor force participation rate than any of the neighboring counties and the state. I think I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I think it was close to 64, 65% in terms of labor force participation, which is a much higher number than the state and much higher than, again, your northern and southern borders of Palm Beach and Miami-Dade that were closer to 60%. So although that is definitely a concern, Brian, in terms of how that's measured and the potential and who's in the labor force is always going to be an issue in terms of monitoring that. There are other measures that do look at underemployed and other labor market measurements. But again, from a data perspective, it's very hard to track that specifically at the county level in the region. So we'll continue to use unemployment rate, but as you pointed out, it's very difficult to really hammer down in terms of the differences in the labor market. If our labor force participation has been declining, that could be a bigger issue. So far, we haven't seen any of those in Broward County. Okay, so I always love this slide. This is the industry outlook, essentially, and I try to provide this. There's a lot of information on this, so I'm glad this is recorded. You may have to go back and review a little bit. I try to give an overview on this, but it's really focused on the major industries in Broward County and what that looks like over the next 5 years. So with this graph, a lot of data here. On the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we're looking at growth. So what does it look like in the next 5 years in terms of job growth? What are they expecting in terms of who's going to add jobs to the industry? On the vertical axis, we look at average earnings. This isn't necessarily pay. It includes bonuses. It includes benefits. So it includes a lot. But one thing that has been very positive for the region is we've seen the trend of this increasing along with inflation, unfortunately. But we have seen wages rise, maybe not necessarily to keep up with, but they have gone up quite a bit in the last year to maybe maintain or offset some of that inflation that we have seen. That's starting to come down a little bit in terms of wage growth, but it is still a positive number. I think the last I saw was about a 2% increase year over year for Broward County. So looking at this graph, we see where these two axes meet. It has an average earnings per worker in Broward County of about $62,000. That has gone up from about $56,000 a year ago when the study was conducted. And then again, those industries that are higher than that pay higher than that average wages or average earnings, and those that are below it typically pay less than the average earnings from an industry level. Obviously, it depends on jobs. Managers are going to likely make more than potentially other employees, and so it's going to be spread out. But from an industry level perspective, we can see what that looks like in terms of wages and growth over the next 5 years in Broward County. The size of the bubble, the last dimension here, or the size of the bubble, is how many people are employed in that industry currently. So when we look at the largest bubble, which is probably the red or light red bubble here in the middle, we see that it pays about average wages. It's maybe slightly below the average earnings. And that it has expected growth over the next 5 years is strong of about 6%. And this includes trade, transportation, and utilities. So any retail trade, wholesale trade, transportation, and utilities are going to be included in this bubble or in this large employer in the region. So that includes, again, quite a few industries, but is able to kind of see that there's a positive output there, and we see some growth. When we look at the right-hand side, we see that most of these industries, other than potentially agriculture, are expecting growth over the next 5 years, specifically the largest being financial services, financial activities. And that has been the case for the last decade in Broward County, seeing that very strong growth. Another one is professional business services, and so we see that strong growth there for another industry that's relatively large in the region. And then finally, the lighter turquoise there is our health and education. Basically fueled by the health industry is really supporting that growth, aging population, need for nurses, all of those will fall into place. And then finally, another one to note is we are expecting a strong recovery in the leisure and hospitality. Tourism is expected to do strong. They're expected to grow at 7% over the next 5 years. As we see, again, these deplanements and other indicators coming back in the dashboard, we can see and expect kind of that industry to bounce back after COVID and the growth that we've seen in Florida for the next 5 years. What I thought would be interesting is to look at with the historical data. It's very difficult to narrow down to race and age and other characteristics in the workforce. But one of the indicators that, or one of the metrics that I had was employment. And so to look at this from a Black or African American perspective in terms of what has the last decade looked like in terms of job growth. And this is still using average wages for the county as a whole. Again, if data was available, I would like to focus in more on the Black and African American average earnings to kind of focus on what that would look like over time. But unfortunately for this, we only have data on the county as a whole. As we're narrowing down, it's difficult to get that data. So we kept the same average earnings per worker assumed, but looked at what growth has really occurred for Black and African American employment in the last decade in Broward County. And it was very positive results, specifically for financial activities. This growth was over 70% in growth for the Black and African community in growth. And so we see over 70% there. And that was much stronger than the overall growth for the financial activities when we look at Broward. I believe it was closer to 60% as a whole. So more growth there. We saw a little bit of less than the community growth overall in terms of health and education services. So that was a little bit lower in that 10-year growth for that perspective. But this does give, again, an insight into where jobs are being created over the last decade and where we see that growth from that perspective. I see two hands up, both from Alicia and Barbara, so happy to open that up to any questions.
I had a question about where does technology fall under in these areas?
Great question, Barbara. So this falls across pretty much, of course, all industries in the sense that they're all using technology. Quite often the IT sector does fall under the professional and business services. So the orange will pick up your traditional IT, such as cybersecurity or other industries that are specifically detailed for IT. So that would likely fall under the orange bubble. But again, IT is pretty much going to fall under everything. The light purple one that you saw up here that has very high average earnings is under what they call information. And that's your traditional media, but also for some reason, the way that they organize this is software publishers. And so where there's actually a couple employers in Broward County that are supporting this industry that have had some growth in the past and pay very high wages. And that's where you're getting that information with such high wages, although low growth, it's getting balanced out by some of the traditional media, newspapers, things like that, that are having some slow growth or to no growth at all. But that's kind of, hopefully that answers your question in terms of where technology lays on this specific graph.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
My question related to the demographic data that you said wasn't available. I do understand that for Broward County, we wouldn't have like more recent data from the American Community Survey, but certainly we should have decennial census data to compare 2020 maybe with 2010 to show some more detail for the specifically for Blacks and African Americans.
Definitely, and that's something that we can look into. I know that I was looking at the 2020 census and having trouble pulling out that data specifically for Broward County. It was for the state itself, it was easier. The other thing that I am often cautious of is the margin of error. If they have a very high margin of error, I try to stay away from providing those statistics because I do want to make sure that the estimate is on par, and sometimes when the margin of error is higher than 10 or 11% of the actual estimate, there is some concern there. I do know that as focused on the business community, that the 2022 survey for small business and business for the census should be coming out soon. So I believe that might be in November. So that's something that I'd like to look at again. But Alicia, you are correct. I should look at the ACS specifically on the 5-year estimates. I know would probably give a better insight into some of this data as well. And hopefully I can follow up with some of that data as well for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So one of the items I wanted to share and show, and as mentioned with some of the census data, I was able to find some data on population and where it's where population resides throughout Broward County. And so I was able to find some data from 2020. looking at census tracts, and specifically in the yellow here, we're looking at the Black or African American population and where mostly reside from a population perspective. And so to focus on that, we wanted to line that up with unemployment. And from this perspective, we don't necessarily have unemployment at the tract level. We don't have unemployment really, and that from a race perspective or from any other perspective, driven down more than Broward County on a monthly basis. But one thing that is interesting that CareerSource Broward tracks, and they have posted this on their dashboard, and something that I'm starting to get used to using is their active job seekers. So this doesn't necessarily, I don't want to share that this relates to unemployment necessarily, but typically to come registered to the system through CareerSource Broward, it might lean a little bit more towards the unemployed than employed, but they do track here where there are job seekers and where they are throughout the zip code level in Broward County. So if we overlay that, or if we look at that, you can compare kind of where populations reside and where the job seekers currently are from a from availability perspective right now, and we see that they do overlap some of those areas. And so this was just one graph or one map that I wanted to share with that, and we can track this over time as Broward County or as CareerSource Broward provides that data that they receive from EmployFlorida.com. So in demand right now, looking at the, again, that dashboard pulls in this data. And so we're able to look at what are the current jobs that are in demand right now. So in Broward County, there's a few columns here, but these are the top jobs that are currently posted and available in terms of job posts online. So with that, just recently, registered nurses was always typically number one. That has come down to number two recently in Broward County. Typically, you'll find it at the top, most likely number one in almost all counties or all MSAs throughout and workforce regions throughout the state. But we have seen a little bit of a decline there in relative to retail salespersons as that overtook the number one spot. But as we look as of April, where these rank, there's still quite a few job postings or unmet demand right now for these job positions. So we have over 1,400 retail sales postings, over 1,200 registered nurses, 1,100 sales reps, and so forth in terms of the top jobs that are available right now in terms of job postings. Pull in some of the average earnings there. Some are below, some are above that average, but again, registered nurses pays well above the regional average. And so we can track, again, what those jobs look like, what's in need right now, and what's in demand, how well it pays, how many are currently employed in the region. And then finally, kind of the percent of the workforce is basically what's in need relative to the size of the workforce. So when we look at something like food service managers, medical health service and health service managers, we see from a management perspective that percentage wise, that's a very high component of who are currently working there. So if there's 5,000 food service managers in Broward County, they're looking for roughly 700 new postings or new jobs to add to that. And so that's a pretty big jump in that specific occupation itself. Again, registered nurses always on the top there. And so in the study, I did a deeper dive into the forecast and what that looks like for the region, along with the outcomes from local institutions and whether or not that's supporting the demand in the region itself. So one thing, sorry, apologize for all the numbers and everything on this slide, but to step back and kind of look, I wanted to see who's coming out of the institutions, the training facilities, and who's being available to fill some of these positions, not only in the short term, but also in the long term. What are some of the trends there? On the positive side, as we look to the left, I looked at the state college and basically associate's degree and less, 1-year training or less, 2-year training, certificates, and then an associate's degree, and the type of occupations that would fill those positions. For that, I looked also from this data that comes out of the National Center for Education Statistics. I tracked this historically and pulled in some recent 2021 data in terms of completions, and looked at that from the Black or African American student and the completions there relative to Broward County and what that looks like from a percentage perspective. For college, again, for a 1-year certificate, a 2-year certificate, or an associate's degree, out of all completions in Broward County, roughly 28.2% were Black or identified Black as or African American. And when we look specifically at some of the trends that are out there, if we look at HVAC, definitely a need in Florida. We see the trend has been positive, that growth has occurred in that region, that again, 8-9 years ago, roughly about 100, 116 were graduating out of the county. 116 students every year out of the county were graduating with an HVAC certificate or completing an HVAC certificate. That number has grown for all students to be about 374 in 2021. That trend has increased. More programs are being offered and being completed as the need for that trade has increased as well. And so we are seeing the institutions react and provide that training for the demand. Again, of that 374 completions, 39% were Black or African American identified for the 2021 completions. On the vehicle maintenance side, 32% completed that program as well. As we look at other programs that have been grown or have seen some strong growth, one is computer and information support services, aligned with the technology industry there. So again, not necessarily going for a full IT bachelor's or master's, but getting a certificate or an associate's degree to show that I've obtained these skill sets needed by the region. It's one of the top jobs, a computer user support. And so as we see that trend that has increased from 600 to over 1,100 students completing a certificate in Broward County, Black or African American population account for almost a quarter of that, or 23.7% of those completions in 2021. The other increasing certificate or associate degree is in entrepreneurship. Small business, starting your own business, getting out there and learning the skills that it requires to start your own entity. We've seen that increase mostly from Broward College and what they offer and the programs that are being completed there, to roughly 500 students completing each year. And about, again, similarly, a quarter of them are Black and African American completing those certificates or those associate degree programs. On the right-hand side, this includes any 4-year program and above. So, of course, master's, PhD, MD, anything on that side, and just pretty much backed out 2 industries to show some trends at the county level. One of the opportunities potentially for African American and Black population is in healthcare. And we see that the percentage there, and especially in nursing, is relatively low to the completion rates. And so it's about 14.3% in 2021 in the healthcare industry, relative to business management and marketing, which, even though the county has been on the decline and not necessarily meeting the needs. We mentioned financial services and professional and business services like accounting and taxes has been on the decline over the last 10 years in Broward County, with a 43% drop, going from almost 3,000 completions to less than 2,000 over the course of the last decade. And on the positive note there, from relative to college completions, we see that 22% are African American or Black that are completing those degrees. So again, an opportunity, a growing field. We saw positive results in the last decade as jobs in the African American community have increased in financial activities. Again, this includes real estate, includes financial service firms, banks, other financial institutions. And so that number has not only increased in the last decade, but also we're starting to see completions do well, even in a declining trend in the community. That's an opportunity potentially there for job opportunities in the future. So stepping back and just looking at the study, just wanted to identify a couple, again, more statistics that are available, more data that's available. One of the concerns that came out of the study, of course, was cost of living in the region, and specifically cost of affordable housing. And that's definitely a concern. It's a concern in Florida, but even more of a concern specifically in Broward County. And definitely I saw some articles out there. And so that focus drew our focus to, again, looking at rent, looking at housing prices, and those are all available on the dashboard, that we track that on a monthly basis and see what that looks like. One of the indexes I like to look at is kind of the rent versus own index. This doesn't mean that it's necessarily easier or harder for affordable housing in Broward County, but I did want to look at kind of what are the differences. And what I would definitely focus on here is really in the 07, 08 bubble that we had, the real estate bubble back in the early 2000s, you really saw rents not keep up with the housing prices. And so it was more of an index looking back, obviously hindsight, but looking back, it was more affordable to rent during that time than potentially buy a home, 2004, 2005, 2006. In this recent times, we have seen in the next picture I'll show an increase in housing prices come back at a rate similar to 04, 05, strong housing prices, affordability is coming down. But on top of that, we've also seen rent increase as well during that time. So unlike 2006, 2007, where affordability maybe leaned towards apartments or leaned towards renting, on the flip side this time, we're just getting into a favorable to rent component, but not necessarily as much as rents continue to rise, probably at the rate of home ownership affordability. And so, again, this is one just to look at that of home affordability and the issue that's faced in the quality of life side. In addition, as we see from a rent to own, I'm sorry, no longer the rent versus own index, but more importantly, looking at the house prices, the average house prices, which we track on that dashboard relative to income levels. And so looking at this from a relative to average earnings, back in 07 to 08, it peaked above 8. Again, that affordability in Florida, that the escalation there of what individuals could buy with multiple of their wage potentially. And we saw after the crash that came back down to a more reasonable level in terms of income to housing price, or income, or your house price to income. And that's starting to tick up again. We start to see that above the 7.5 range. So almost back to the 07, 08 levels that we saw at the peak of affordability in terms of housing prices. This is making a lot of assumptions. It uses a millage rate of I think 12 basis points, and it uses a 20% down payment relative to rent. And so it takes a lot into account, but from the previous slide and this one, but here we're looking at affordability, and it really is showing that we're back to those early 05, 06 levels, and housing affordability is definitely an issue in the community. And then finally, just one other item I like to track on that dashboard is we do have, which was shocking to me, the most headquartered companies throughout Florida are in Broward County relative to any other county in the state. So I believe it was 17 or 18 companies that are headquartered in Broward County. I guess I expected Miami-Dade or Orange County to have potential, or Duval County to maybe have more, but no. From the top 100, Broward County ranked the highest during that time. So I decided to put together maybe a stock index. Again, this is to give business community an idea of, what is, if we assume stocks take into account what the economy looks like, we could track it from the regional level with these 17 or 18 different companies. We see that aerospace and defense is one of the larger companies there that make up the index, along with internet retail, and with some of the companies that are there. So there's a diverse group of companies, but probably not similar to maybe the S&P 500 or something like that. But if we track that, we can see that this index picked up pretty well after the shutdown. So we saw an increase of quite high right after the pandemic. Again, maybe opening up early in Florida had the impact there that supported some of these companies. And lately, we've seen kind of a trend to stick with the S&P 500 or the NASDAQ, and lately kind of a little bit of decline. And that may be business specific, but just something that we like to track and follow in terms of what the local index would look like relative to the US or the national indexes that are followed. So with that, I just wanted to give a couple, and Barbara, I do see a hand, so I did want to give it a second there if you had any questions.
With the previous slide, I'm surprised the marine industry isn't part of that index.
And there, some of the marine industry is picked up in the aerospace and defense. So some of those contracts that are won, we have looked into, and it's just how they're classified. So even the internet retail, for example, it is more designed for a specialty or specific part of internet retail, but that's how it's classified in the larger space. So that aerospace and defense does pick up some of the marine industry in there, along with I believe some of the auto and truck dealerships might fall in there as well from the marine industry from a sales perspective.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so for just a couple conclusions, this is more on the national level and relative to Broward, but I'm, again, as an economist, we're called the dismal science. I'm usually a pessimist, and this is unfortunately just the example of my labor market, and I thought that it was going to get kind of worse from last year, but it only got stronger. I do believe, however, from a optimistic perspective, that there is this potential for a soft landing. You know, maybe avoid a complete recession, or the recession be relatively weak. So we are seeing that trend of rising prices falling. So Federal Reserve policy is working. There's discussion of potentially holding back on future raises in interest rates. And so that's definitely has helped in terms of, again, bringing prices down. They want to get down to that 2 to 3% range in inflation. And it looks like we're getting close to that. Some of the forecasts from the Federal Reserve, from the Bureau of Labor Market Statistics, do suggest that unemployment is going to tick up by the end of the year. We have seen some layoffs in technology, for example, and other changes occur in some job postings fall relative to the peak. So the potential for the unemployment rate to maybe come back up at the national level, back to 4.5%. Again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. As we switch jobs, as we move from one career to another, that all gets picked up in unemployment, or what we call the natural rate of unemployment. And we expect that to necessarily go up a little bit as the labor market is very hot right now. It might be good to see unemployment tick up a little bit. Of course, it always matters if it's to you or to the to the entire community or to the entire U.S. Example, but we do see unemployment tick up a little bit by the year end. And part of that could happen because of some of the new concepts or new hot topics like artificial intelligence, automation, what impact that's going to have on hiring and on the job market. Personally, I think that there will be certain industries and certain sectors that do see a decline in hiring and a decline in jobs. However, I do believe that similar to, I hear the example of when internet came aboard, as it takes time to acclimate this technology and get used to it. I do believe that productivity will be higher, and we'll actually find potentially new jobs and other things that we can use this tool for in the future to help have higher productivity and potentially higher output for the U.S. and for the economy as a whole. The second thing to take away, though, is that Florida, and specifically Broward, from the study and from the last year of data that we've looked at, is poised to take advantage, especially if we have a soft landing. If we have a very hard landing similar to 06, 07, 08, housing prices are really going to hurt. There's going to be a bigger impact there, specifically because of the financial services and the real estate construction. Those industries are really going to take a hit if we have a very hard landing. If there's a banking crisis again, right, that would flow over to more of a hard landing. Maybe we have a bigger pull down. But if we are able to navigate this, and again, the Fed has done very well recently in maintaining that peak of 8% inflation. They said it was transitory, which it was not. They adjusted quickly, raised rates to accommodate for that, and we saw inflation coming down. If we do have that soft landing, I think Broward County and Florida will do very well in terms of acclimated or in terms of taking advantage of that and still seeing strong growth. We expect to see employment growth. Broward County was much stronger than Florida, much stronger than the US at 4.2% over the last year. So very strong employment growth. Unemployment rate, as I mentioned, was very low at 2.5%. And their labor force growth, as we talked about, in terms of people participating in the economy and looking for jobs, and has grown 4% roughly in the last year for Broward County. So all positive numbers, stronger than Florida, which is already a very strong state in the region, or state in the U.S. And so very positive numbers for Broward County. And I think, again, with that strong labor force participation rate, has a lot of opportunities through this soft landing to turn around, hopefully see some housing affordability come down, but yet take advantage of that and see some growth in the future. So again, thank everyone for this, and thank you for the opportunity, and hopefully some of the information was helpful, and happy to take any questions there might be.
I just want to say thanks a lot. It's helping me as well in terms of the marine industry, understanding an affordable housing industry, and particularly as it relates to workforce housing and how that impacts in terms of folks getting qualified for mortgages and understanding the trends in terms of the industry. So this is really helpful. I really appreciate you, Aaron.
Thanks, Brian. One thing that came out of not necessarily came out of the study, but that has been in some talks, and I think that'll be interesting from Florida's perspective, Brian. You mentioned this a little bit with affordability. I know one of the issues is commercial real estate right now, and Broward County is struggling a little bit, I think, with commercial real estate relative to its peers, northern and south. And so one of the concepts, and this is throughout Florida, so I don't think it's necessarily a novel idea, but it will be interesting to see if policy changes and adapts to some of these issues with affordable housing. And the way what I'm leaning towards is more on rezoning, looking at commercial real estate. I saw an article today about I don't think it was in Florida, but again, an abandoned high school that was turned into apartments, and the firm that took over that and revised that. I know locally they're looking at potentially turning an old mall that was struggling into maybe senior living, and the Walgreens could stay in there and still have a couple renters, commercial rentals, but turning the rest into maybe senior housing. So I think policy might help some of this and affect, and maybe some change in policy and some new ideas could come out of this to help on the affordable housing side. I know in Broward it seems like I think the only way to go is up in terms of being landlocked and new housing, but new opportunities exist there. And one of the positives that I looked at for Broward County was on the permit side. Although if we are going to see a soft landing or some sort of landing, we didn't see the excessive building we saw in 05, 06, 07 with permits coming out. And that's not the case throughout the state. In my county, for example, I'm actually seeing permits are being, and we have a different growth, I think, but permits are being at a higher rate than they were in 07, 08. And that makes me very concerned that if we do have a downturn, there's going to be a lot of supply available and really impact residential housing. So so just some interesting thoughts there in terms of potentially rezoning and the impacts that might have for problems like that exist.
Absolutely, because we've been looking at the use of tiny homes, cottage homes, and modular homes as a result. But Florida's construction codes, permitting codes, building codes are one of the most difficult in the United States, and I want to see how they respond to particularly the modular homes. There's a couple of projects going up in Hollywood, but how does that relate in terms of the environment, the wind impact, hurricanes, and things like that? So it'll be interesting to see, because it is cheaper to build per square foot and quicker to get up, but I think a lot of municipalities haven't bought into it yet.
Right. Yeah, definitely. There's the pros and cons for that, and then insurance becoming another issue as well. That's a whole nother issue in the state.
Yeah. No, thank you. This was very informative. Just to the point of the development part, during this last session, the Florida legislature actually passed, I think it's $717 million program for affordable, in air quotes, housing, to kind of free up retail space that has kind of been locked, but they may be on a main area where a bus comes through or some other form of transportation. So, you know, they want to connect. The argument is connecting these abandoned, if you will, retail spaces, making it affordable housing, and then boom, people are very close to transportation to get to jobs and move around throughout the area to you know make the to be able to support their family. So it's going to be interesting to see the impact on that and if people really pick up on that. And it's so funny that you said, you know, you're going to have to kind of build up. And there was a provision in there that I guess the development can't be any higher because a lot of these can be in, you know, some residential areas. So a lot of people were concerned with that. It can't be any higher than, I guess, the tallest building in a mile radius or something like that was kind of the compromise there. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out, given the, you know, the complaints we obviously hear from our small business owners, you know, the difficulty of finding people who can be close to where they work, given the lack of affordability of housing in this current market.
And with it, I just wanted to mention one of the positives that came out of that for Broward County in the study was this change over the last decade of a county that was a commuter to, right? That everyone was coming into Broward County to work, and then they would leave afterwards. And so we actually saw a difference back in, you know, a decade ago of 100,000 people that would come into the region, work, and then go home. When we factor everybody leaving and coming back in, and all the numbers that go in, that number has shrunk to almost zero. And so those that are working in Broward want to live there. And that again speaks to the quality of life, speaks to some of the other concepts there. But we saw that decline, that leaving the county to get a job and then coming back after to live there. People want to live there, want to stay where they're working. And so that was a kind of a positive outcome that came out from the study as well.
No, perfect. Well, I just want to thank you once again, good doctor, because I know that you are a doctor in a different sense, right? But nonetheless, it's still very important to our small businesses and our community, our you know, economic ecosystem down here and understanding what's happening. So this was a very critical and important presentation. So I thank you for your time, as I know you are in high demand these days. Thank you as well to Career Source Broward for making the connection and making this happen. Before you hopped on, Barbara, I was telling them that we had an economist last January to kind of, you know, get us jumpstart us to the year as to what we might expect. And we tried to do the same thing this year, and we're like running down economists. It's just hard to get a hold of these guys. But thank you for making the connection and for sponsoring the event today. Did you want to say a little something?
No, I'm thankful that Dr. Schmerbach was able to speak to the community that the Broward Black Chamber of Commerce is servicing. So that way they understand how to prepare business-wise for the future and just to understand what is coming down the pipeline to prepare and build out their workforce development. And I'm glad we're here as a partner to help with that strategy. So we're thankful that you were able to share this information.
Perfect. Thank you. Once again, thank you, Dr. Schmerbach. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you all for joining us. I know that we had people join at different times. So this, of course, will be on our YouTube page. So you can watch it on demand whenever you want to. And it will also be in our newsletter link to make it easily accessible to you. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you on June 1st for our disaster preparedness event as we prepare to enter hurricane season.
Yes.
So thank you. And have a good day, everyone.